Hello and welcome back to our continued discussion on the painter Ingres. In the first half, we looked at a selection of paintings from Napoleon to the Oedipus to Jupiter and Thetis. And I want to just remind you that all of these were done while technically Ingres was still studying with the Royal Academy. He had won the Prix de Rome in 1801 but was unable to travel to Rome until 1806. And once there, he would actually continue to stay far beyond the period of his study. Part of the reason was the reception of his works back in Paris. They found his work a bit strange. It was too linear, too concise, too frozen. His portrait of Napoleon was criticized as Gothic. He showed too much favor to that northern style, and not enough reverence or looking back in his own style back to the Italian manner, which was so dominant in the academic tradition. He goes to Rome in 1806, and while there, the influence of the Italians does become an important aspect of his style. Most importantly, it's Raphael and the Mannerist Bronzino. So with Raphael, we think back to his style with the beautiful but idealized and slightly geometric forms of his portraits of the Madonna. And with Bronzino, the Mannerist, we think of that slightly elongated, very elegant, but also almost posturing, almost artificial, and itself almost a kind of frozen style, especially in the secular work associated with Mannerism, the portraiture. And while we certainly can't reduce it to some magical mathematical formula where Raphael plus Bronzino plus Jan van Eyck equals Ingres, ta-da! But we do see elements of those earlier artists manifest in Ingres' style from this earlier period and even in his later works. So he's sending back the Oedipus and the Sphinx and the Bather as examples of his progress while he's in Rome back up to the Academy, and they're continuously not received well. They're very much criticized. They are continuing to be critiqued as not well modeled, the line is too harsh, and there's just something inorganic or maybe too organic about the figures. They just somehow don't resolve. And his Jupiter and Thetis of 1811, which was the magnus opus of his academic training, was yet again received with disdain. However, in contrast to the criticism he receives in Paris, he is building his reputation in Rome. He is finding clients, he is becoming well known, and securing a reputation with portraits like this. And so he stays. He continues to work in Rome until 1820. Unfortunately, just as it seemed like Ingres was finding success, external events intrude. With the fall of Napoleon, many of the French, who happened also to be his patrons, left Rome, and so the cash flow stops. He's no longer getting commissions for history-style paintings or expensive oil paintings, and so instead he relies on his skills as a draftsman and produces a lot of drawn portraits. A lot of these are for English tourists who come to Italy, and many of these, such as the example here, lead to speculation about him using drawing devices because they're so well articulated, so concise, and were produced pretty rapidly. We'll get to that in the lecture on photography. Ingres himself did not want to build his reputation as a portrait painter, as we've discussed other artists wanting to achieve that level of history painting in the past. That's still his ultimate goal. But it is the portraits, such as these, for which he is largely known today. But now let's turn to his most famous painting, one that was commissioned before the fall of Napoleon, which was commissioned by Napoleon's sister for her husband. She happened to be queen, and he happened to be king of Naples. But in 1814, Napoleon was deposed and sent into exile twice, meaning that Caroline and her husband would also lose power, meaning that this painting no longer had a home, and so in 1819 it was shown at the Paris Salon. Both scandalous and evocative, Ingres' Grande Odalisque turned quite a few heads that year at the Salon, and it was, along with Géricault's Raft of the Medusa, among the most groundbreaking and talked about paintings at that year's event. Since then, despite the numerous portraits and history paintings painted by Ingres, the theme of the Odalisque in 19th century painting is nearly synonymous with his name. The Grande Odalisque, painted in 1814, has become the textbook image for Ingres. If you've taken a class where you even have a cursory look at this period in art history, you've probably seen this painting. It is considered a landmark, and it is considered an example of the Orientalist spirit of the Romantic period. We also see the idea of Orientalism discussed in the painting by Gros of Napoleon visiting his troops in Jaffa, because, like this painting, it conjured imagery for the eyes of the viewers in Paris of what the Middle East looked like. So why did this become so popular? Well, part of it was because of Napoleon and because of his campaigns beyond Europe. But the ideas of an exotic far-off land, the Near East, infiltrated Europe in more than one way. A very famous example were the writings Letters from Turkey by the wife of a British ambassador, Lady Montagu. Her writings, in which she describes the journey through the Middle East, the traditions, the religions, the way of life, conjured notions of this far-off land to the Europeans. And though her writings were considered more accurate than earlier descriptions, she was still describing this region from an outsider's perspective. And it was but one of many ingredients, sort of like the excavation at Pompeii was one of many ingredients that added to the revitalization of classicism. So it's through these different avenues that Orientalism is a strong undercurrent of the early Romantic period. But we also have to remember that Ingres wasn't just in his studio whipping up exotic scenes of an Orient he had never been to. Instead, this painting, the Grande Odalisque, was a commissioned work. It was specifically sought from the Queen of Naples for her husband, the King, and, by the way, the Queen of Naples was also Napoleon's little sister. Caroline Bonaparte Murat and her husband, Joachim, ruled Naples from 1808 to 1814. During this time, Caroline established herself with quite the reputation as a patron for the arts. Some describe her as trying to remake her image as a modern-day Marie de Medici. She commissioned works from both French and Italian artists, including Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun, Antonio Canova, the great sculptor, and for our purposes here, Ingres, and, more to the point, the Grande Odalisque. Ingres' painting of Le Grande Odalisque is often heralded as a inventive new genre for the female nude. So we're no longer limited to just portraying Venus or beautiful nymphs in the nude from Greek mythology, but now we have a whole new category. Well, yes and no. It is new in that it really jumpstarts this category and it makes it very popular, and over time Ingres will begin to paint several more of these, and then a few decades later it'll be revived again in the hands of the early modern artist. However, it is not entirely without precedent. We can look to specific influences of Ingres in this composition. First, we want to remember that this was commissioned by Caroline Bonaparte. Why is this important? Well, we can look at another work that was commissioned by another one of Napoleon's sisters, Pauline, and note it's actually quite similar, only she has herself portrayed as Venus victorious, so a little bit of a scandal here. The emperor's little sister has herself portrayed in the guise of Venus and a reclining nude. Only Pauline could have pulled that off. Another precedent for Ingres' paintings wasn't a female nude, but if you look at the position of Madame Récamier in this portrait by Jacques-Louis David in 1800, it is strikingly similar to the posture of Le Grande Odalisque by Ingres 14 years later. So in 1800, Ingres was still in France, David was his mentor. Ingres undoubtedly saw this painting. So maybe it's been lurking in his mind, who knows, but he's obviously taking this basic composition and playing with it, and he really amps up the sensuality. Obviously, she's now a nude, and we'll look at the distortions of the figure. But before we do, one last precedent, and that's much earlier. It's a Rococo painting. Actually, a few different paintings, although we're only going to look at one, and it's the Brunette Odalisque by Francois Boucher. So Boucher actually did a few different versions of the Odalisque, the Blonde Odalisque, the Brunette Odalisque. In some of them, it's believed that his wife served as the model of the Odalisque. In others, King Louis XV's mistress as the model for the Odalisque. But there were a few different paintings. These were all private commissions originally, but some of them were shown at later salons, and in fact, in 1767, the Brunette Odalisque was shown publicly, much to the horror of Denis Diderot. You'll remember he was one of those neoclassical philosophers, the philosophes, that we talked about. Sometimes when I first show this painting, I ask everyone, what do they think? And do they think he's very skilled? Do they think this is a choice? Or do they think that this is the best he can do? And invariably, answers come from both sides. But I'm going to argue that it is very much an intentional choice made by Ingres. He's purposefully elongating and stylizing the human figure. I think one of my favorite quotes actually comes from one of my students, who pointed out that Ingres disregarded the limits of the human body in order to serve the needs of the composition. And I thought, that's just perfect. He was actually criticized for this painting. One critic famously claimed that she had 3 extra vertebrae. That's the only way her back could stretch so long. But for Ingres, it didn't matter, vertebrae, +3, -3, whatever. He wants this long, serpentine, sensual back that she can twist and turn and look around back at the viewer. He's not concerned with reality. He's concerned with creating this idea. And again, this notion of this archetype in which it's idealized. When something's idealized, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's realistic. In fact, it's usually not. And so the idealized, beautiful odalisque here has this impossibly long back, and then her legs swell up just to get that beautiful, graceful curve. And then her feet are impossibly small, actually, for this odalisque. So while some of the fictions Ingres creates are quite obvious, like her long back and those extra vertebrae, others are more subtle, and the subject he popularized, an exotic fantasy of an odalisque, or a harem girl, effectively combined the tradition of a reclining nude Venus, which was first brought to us by the great Venetian painter Titian, and he combines it with the notion of a trony, which is simply a portrait of an imaginary person or type. The most famous example of the trony genre is certainly Vermeer's Girl with the Pearl Earring from 1665. Back to the Grande Odalisque, what we essentially have is an anonymous young European model. She's given a few props, and voila, she becomes Le Grande Odalisque. Once a gift between an amorous royal couple, Queen Caroline and Murat, a few years later it becomes the scandal at the Paris Salon. But just give it a few more years and it essentially establishes a new acceptable format to portray the female nude, and not just for private commissions, but for public consumption. So let's turn back to portraiture for one final example and see how and where these ideas of Mannerist distortion are actually present in these portraits, which at first seem so realistic. This is a late portrait. Ingres is now in his 60s, and he's depicting the young Comtesse d'Ausenville, or the Princess Broly. And if we compare his initial sketches with the final drawing, we see how much has actually been manipulated along the way. In the initial drawing, a sketch made from life, we get much more of the nuance of the human figure, and when we compare that later to the final painting, we recognize immediately how idealized into these perfect geometries the human figure has been conformed into. This is especially noticeable in her face, which in the drawing is oval and almost impossibly round in the painting. He's such a master at this point in his career. This is all so subtle that we barely recognize what he's done. If we compare Ingres' portraits with a luminous Madonna by Raphael, we can find parallels between the idealization through the use of harmonious geometries in the human figure and throughout the composition. And yet, if we put it next to one of Bronzino's figures, we can also find parallels between the stylization, the elongation, the exaggeration of certain parts of the human anatomy. So how did he go from being criticized for all of these different characteristics to becoming the darling of the Academy? Well, the story changed in 1824, and so in the 1820s there's this split in the Academy. Neoclassicism is declining, and you have the young romantics, which seem to be taking the place over. And so in 1824, Ingres shows the painting, The Bow of Louis XIII, and it's this epic, historical history painting with religious overtones of the king swearing his allegiance to the Madonna and Child, and it is an epic, grand, neoclassical painting, received with huge accolades. And with this, Ingres secures his position as the leading neoclassicist at the Academy. As we move forward, we'll see the Academy itself is threatened as we transition away from the traditional and the academic into the modern, and yet even in the modern age, with all of its change, Ingres has secured his legacy. We'll see how in a couple of weeks.